Hi, this is Fish and welcome to Fish Picks. You often hear it said that tension accounts for 80% of good lockpicking technique, and yet there seems to be a lot of contradictory advice floating around the community. So I decided to pay more attention to tension. I've taken a deep dive into some of the best advice in the YouTube locksport community, and today I'm going to share what I found out with you. In part one of this two-part series, we'll be looking at why tension matters so much, how to read the feedback you get from the pin stacks, and the mysterious world of contact mind reading. And then in part two, we'll go on to look at the relative merits of top of the keyway versus bottom of the keyway tension, before going on to compare Bosnian Bill and the lockpicking lawyers' approaches to tension to see what we can learn from them. So let's get into it. First, a basic primer on tensioning a lock. We apply rotational torque to a lock for two reasons: to produce feedback from the pins we're manipulating with our pick so we'll know what to do next, and to create the conditions which will cause the lock to open once the key pins are at the shear line and the driver pins are sitting at the bottom of the Bible. If you're not familiar with this basic terminology and the mechanism of a pin tumbler lock, I'd invite you to check out number 5 in this series entitled Lockpicking Lingo for Beginners, where I cover all of these terms along with an explanation of lock tolerances and binding order, which you'll need for the following to make sense. Assuming you are up to speed, let's carry on. So we know that there are 4 fundamental states a pin stack can be in, which will provide different kinds of feedback. A pin can be unset, underset, set, or overset. The differences between each state are defined by the relationship between the key pin, driver pin, and shear line. We've already identified that an unset driver pin is one that is sitting at the bottom of the plug, resting on its key pin under spring pressure. It'll therefore feel springy to the touch. An underset pin is one which is binding and has been pushed some way towards the shear line but not far enough to clear that line. The key pin will have dropped back down into the plug and will no longer be under spring pressure, so will feel loose and lighter because the only resistance this little disc of metal provides will be from its own weight and gravity. A set pin is in this same state, but the driver pin has cleared the shear line and is no longer preventing the plug from rotating. So it's important to note that the key pin will feel the same whether a pin is underset or set. Finally, an overset pin stack is one in which both the driver pin and some of the key pin have been pushed up into the Bible where they are bound, and in this case it's the key pin rather than the driver pin which is preventing rotation. Both pins are still under spring tension, but the compression involved may make it feel more solid than springy, and you'll have to probe higher into the Bible to feel anything. And I'll say a bit more about the feedback from overset pins in a while. The amount of tension applied to the plug can be thought of as being on a continuum. We could talk about newtons of force applied, but this wouldn't really be practically useful. So let's instead use the simpler metric of light, moderate, and heavy tension, which is of course entirely subjective, but it's what we have to work with. To begin, all of the pins will be in an unset state and springy. Without rotational tension or with too little tension applied to the plug, the pins will simply move freely up and down in their respective chambers rather than bind. While too much tension will prevent most of the pins from moving up and down at all because they'll mostly be bound. And what constitutes too little or too much tension will vary depending on the individual lock. This is one of the things that makes lockpicking an art and not just a set of mechanical actions to be performed like a paint-by-numbers set. It's the ability to feel, interpret, and then respond to the feedback being received which will determine whether we can or can't open a lock. So let's assume you are applying the right amount of tension to receive good feedback. Most of the pins will feel springy, they're not yet binding, and this tells you that you can move on from these and return to them later, but one of them will be your first binding pin. You'll know when you find it because you'll feel more resistance as you press against it, suggesting that the rotational force is directly acting on this pin at this time. If you apply the correct degree of upward pressure to that pin, it will become set, and this is often accompanied by a subtle movement of the keyway in the direction of rotational pressure and a satisfying sharp click. Remember that feedback can be auditory as well as kinesthetic. This is also why using a vice with some locks can be a good idea. A hand can sometimes dampen these sounds and sensations, whereas a vice can serve as an amplifier. If you receive no click at all, it might be worth palpating that pin stack gently in case you have an underset pin instead. In layman's terms, this is sometimes referred to as a jiggle test. This jiggling motion can be enough to tease the pin the last of the way to the shear line while reducing the chances of oversetting it instead. Of course, not all models and makes of lock will provide crisp clicks, and bear in mind that the intensity of that feedback increases or decreases as you move along the continuum. As a general rule, light tension produces more feedback, but it can be very subtle, whereas heavy tension produces less feedback, but what you do get is more pronounced. Now, if you apply too much upward force to the binding pin instead and overset it, you may still get a click, but it will often be duller, and it will feel as if the pin stack is compressed and less springy, because it is. A surefire way of identifying an overset pin stack is to probe the bottom of the plug and see if you can still feel the key pin. If you can't feel a thing, then you probably overset it, in which case you'll have to ease off on the tension to allow this pin to drop back down. If this is done skillfully, you'll be able to release that single key pin and the driver will be held in the set position. But often both the key pin and the driver pin will drop, and if you can't figure out which pins, if any, are overset, you'll need to remove the tension completely, reset the whole plug and start over. When you do this, you'll often hear and feel a series of springy clicks as the pins fall back into their starting positions. It can be hard to let go of a half-picked lock, but can often be faster and less frustrating than soldiering on with bad intel. It's important then to try and keep track of the state of each pin, and that's why experienced pickers will often hold a running commentary, whether out loud to the camera or silently, so they can remember which pins have been set and which must be returned to. Some even jot it down on a pad next to them as a reference so they can concentrate on the feedback more fully without worrying about losing track of the emerging binding order. Until you can consistently feel and understand the feedback you're getting from tensioning, picking can feel a bit of a lottery, which is why tension control is critical to progressing in the sport. Some pickers start from the back of the plug and work forwards one pin at a time, while others start from the front and work backwards. I haven't come across any reason why one approach might be better than the other, although I suspect that the bitting of the key may come into play here. On trickier locks, you'll need to work on the binding order, whilst also being aware of the fact that the cuts of the key might cause you to overset some pins along the way. And you may have to set a pin more than once, particularly if you're dealing with security pins. I know from experience that when this Sparrow's cutaway is pinned with all standard driver pins, the binding order is 4, 3, 5, 1, 2. But this time I've pinned it so that there are standard pins in the first 4 chambers with the spool in chamber number 5. So let's see how this affects the binding order and the feedback produced during the picking process. I'm going to be applying clockwise moderate tension to the plug and will be using a Lishi tool so that I can be as precise as possible in demonstrating these principles. Working from the front of the plug, I can feel that pins 1, 2 and 3 are springy, but pin 4 is binding. So with a little upward pressure on that pin, I can move it to set. Having done so, I like to be systematic in my approach, so I'm going to go back to the front of the plug and probe each of the pins in turn, this time 1, and 2 remains springy, but 3 is now binding, so again I move it to set. So far, we followed the expected order, but now is where things diverge. This time, making a 3rd pass from the front of the plug, I can feel 1 is binding, and I move it to set, and now 2 is binding, and as I set this pin, we get a dramatic shift of the tensioning bar towards the direction of opening. This is because as 2 was set, there were no standard pins left and the plug rotated to sit against the milled profile of the spool in position 5, producing a false set. By paying attention to the feedback, you'll now know that you have a security pin in the last chamber. If you're less attentive, or if the rotation on the false set is more subtle, you might just assume that you've set pin 2 and will continue, so let's look at what that might feel like. Moving to the front of the plug one last time, pins 1, 2, 3 and 4 feel loose and light, indicating that they are set. But the last pin feels stuck and will not move no matter how much upward pressure I apply, because the tension I am applying is preventing the head of the spool from progressing towards the Bible. If I ease off a little on the tension and push upwards with the pick, I can feel the wrench go into counter rotation as the spool body attempts to realign in the chamber so that the head can clear the obstruction and move to the set point. This counter rotation can be almost imperceptible in some locks and clearly apparent in others. If your finger pressure on the tensioner is too heavy at this point, you can mask it altogether. If you are responsive to the feedback though, by easing off just a little, it's possible to hit the tensioning sweet spot and set the security pin without disturbing any of the others, in which case you would then move from counter rotation into full rotation in the direction of force and the lock will open. Typically though, in setting the spool in this lock, I'll drop one or more of the standard pins because of the kinetic shock caused as the head of the spool moves to the shear line, and so I will then need to go back and deal with these one at a time before the plug will turn. I suspect this is something I'll improve with more practice, so let's take a look at another example of that same process. You can think of the security pin as a gatekeeper, or like a snake in a game of snakes and ladders that's designed to slow your progress towards the finish line, except that once you've slid down and dealt with the snake, it disappears from the board until only ladders remain, which would have been a far better game, come to think of it. If you've got more than one snake or security pin in play, then this process of dropping into a false set, hunting for the security pin via counter rotation, setting it, and then returning to the other pins to manage the fallout can become far more complex than the example we've just looked at. Each time a security pin is activated, it's likely to undo some of our hard work, and it also demands that we manage counter rotation successfully each time, providing another opportunity for dropped pins. The more security pins you come up against, the more complex the feedback becomes, and the more the hunt for the correct binding order becomes elusive, and that's all part of the fun. This is why I think it's a good idea to develop sensitivity to feedback using a training lock, which has been pinned with just 1 or 2 security pins at first in known positions. That way you'll be able to match the feedback you're receiving to what you know is going on inside the plug. This will accelerate your ability to read feedback, and then, when you're dealing with a real-world lock, you'll be better able to respond to the unknown factors involved. You can also spice things up by switching whether you apply clockwise or counterclockwise torque, which is likely to change the binding order. This can be a really useful hack when you're working on a lock and are unable to establish the binding order, or if you're continually oversetting pins because of the cuts involved. In this case, the binding order for anti-clockwise torque on the Sparrow's cutaway becomes much more straightforward. So now we've got a good working understanding of the relationship between tension, feedback, and the various conditions a pin stack can be in, I want to take a brief diversion to talk about why tensioning and feedback is such an interesting process. In the 19th century, at the height of vaudeville theatre, there were a number of performers who claimed to be able to read the mind of another person through the subtlest of physical contact. For example, A series of objects could be laid on a table, and a person would be asked to just think of one of them. Then the performer would take them by the wrist and guide their hand over each of the objects in turn, moving back and forth between them until they would announce confidently which they were thinking of. The spectator would swear blind they didn't knowingly give any clues away, and yet sure enough, the miracle worker seemed to be able to pluck the thought from their mind's eye. These performers were demonstrating a skill that would come to be known as Hellstromism, after the famed magician Axel Hellstrom, who was one of the first to demonstrate the skill, while others refer to it simply as contact mind reading or muscle reading. Whether they knew the process involved or were simply following their intuition, such entertainers were picking up on tiny unconscious and involuntary muscular spasms and then using that information to zero on the target object, a bit like a human GPS system. These muscular twitches are known as ideomotor responses. The same thing is at play when you're walking along holding hands and know intuitively when your partner wants to cross the street or stop to look in a shop window. This is the same skill which I think we are honing in locksport. It's simply we're reading the secret knowledge of the pin stacks rather than the thoughts of another person, and it's our mastery of the tensioning tool connecting us to the locking mechanism that is therefore so critical to our success. So that brings us to the end of part 1 of this 2-part topic, and I'll release the second half as soon as possible. Thanks for joining me today. Please do subscribe if this was in any way helpful, and take care of yourselves.